At the start of the episode, Tagomi finds himself outside the same house he had traveled to before. He approaches the front door, walks past an American flag in the process, and rings the bell. The same woman opens the front door. He is once again breathless to see his wife, Michiko. His wife, however, isn't too pleased to see him and tells him that she has to go to work. Tagomi slowly wanders around a typical suburban American household. As he inspects the room, he finds divorce papers already signed by his wife and awaiting his signature. He then flips on the television broadcasting news about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In New York, Juliana manages to arrange a meeting with George Dixon in Central Park. George stresses that she wasted Trudy's efforts to aid the resistance, but when Juliana mentions the man in the high castle, she grabs his attention. Juliana then reveals to him that she saw a film depicting a nuclear detonation of San Francisco, and that George is the key reason why it will happen. George is in a state of confusion as he has no motive to possibly destroy his former home. Suddenly, 4 disguised resistance members approach Juliana in retaliation for freeing Joe. George waves them off only on the condition she becomes a willing associate in the takedown of Smith. In Berlin, Joe's father, Martin Huesman, pleads with Joe to take a final trip just as he makes his way to the airport for New York. Joe hesitatingly agrees. Huesman takes his son to an abandoned building, a state-sponsored birthing center where volunteer women would birth the next generation of Nazis. Martin then reveals that Joe was born there and that a year after his birth, Elsa, Joe's mother, kidnapped him and escaped to America to save him from the insane institution. Joe refuses to believe his mother lied about him being born an American. He realizes that everything he has come to know isn't true. He storms off, leaving his father standing alone in a crumbling birthing room, before eventually bursting into tears in an empty room. Later on, Joe accepts his father's plea to stay in Berlin. In the following scene, Frank speaks with Ed about his night defending the explosive. However, Ed quickly discovers through intuition what Frank actually did. Frank then returns to the resistance hideout to see Gary and Sarah. Gary offers him a beer, and Frank soon starts to ask him about the films. As Frank tells the resistance members about the film where he has been executed, their posture suddenly changes. Gary then lists off all the names of the members who had been in the films and dies. He steps closer to Frank and encourages him to fight to avoid such a humiliating end, although knowing everyone will die eventually. Japanese and Nazis' relations stiffen as Inspector Kaido learns that Smith has personally sponsored Juliana's asylum. He personally goes to Smith's headquarters in New York to deliver a request for Juliana's arrest. Sensing that Kaido already knew his request would be refused, Smith questions the true purpose of his arrival, but details aren't revealed as the show cuts toward Kaido leaving Smith's office after their meeting concludes. Meanwhile, Tagomi walks the streets of alternate San Francisco, where America won World War II. He enters a bookstore. People surrounding him talk about the bomb, and there's fear of Russia. Tagomi picks up a book and learns about the fall of the Nazis and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Sergeant Yoshida arrives in Childen's antique shop to check on what they're doing. He threatens Ed to make himself more useful. Ed assures Yoshida that he'll recount every detail of their meetings with the Yakuza, and the man leaves, warning him to continue to keep a close watch on the operation. At night in a forest, Gary, Frank, and Sarah attend Karen's memorial. They stand quietly, hats in hand, as they listen to service for their fallen friend. Other resistance members leave items in her memory as Gary places Lem's harmonica in the casket. As things conclude, Sarah then looks at Frank and quietly tells him he is now a resistance member. Meanwhile, Juliana attends a family dinner in New York at the Smith household. Since the children have never been outside their city, they eagerly ask Juliana if the Japanese eat dogs and cats in the Pacific states. However, a phone call interrupts their conversation. It's Joe. He questions Smith as to whether he knew all along about Joe's birth history, which Smith admits to knowing. However, it wasn't his place to tell him. Angered that Smith kept it hidden, Joe relinquishes his service and slams the phone down, dismissing the conversation. Sometimes later, a resistance truck pulls up in front of an abandoned barn. Lem has traveled to a warehouse in the countryside. He paces but is calm as the door swings open to reveal the man in the high castle, Hawthorne Benson. Lem picks up a stack of films to be brought in with them, and finds the vast remaining storage of films all messily piled up. Hawthorne has memorized all the films and decides to burn the entire structure to erase all traces of the films. While they prepare to leave, Hawthorne throws a match, and the nitrate film explodes in flame. Back to an alternate reality, Tagomi returns to the house. This time, his son, Noryuki, is angry at him for always disappearing. and abandoning his mother. Tagomi is confused as he claims he never made such an action, but promises to stay with them. Tagomi calmly retorts that he wishes to live in the present. However, their conversation is interrupted by the cries of Noriyuki's infant son. Noriyuki calls for his wife. There's a moment of silence as Juliana steps out of the kitchen with a screaming baby in her arms. Tagomi is shocked to learn that his daughter-in-law is alternate Juliana, who doesn't seem to know about their prior history in the other dimension. After sleeping over in his alternate house, Tagomi wakes up to his son, Noriyuki, hosting a ban the bomb meeting. Noriyuki asks his father to sign the divorce papers privately, but Tagomi is highly conflicted. He sees Juliana. She smiles. Her arm is wrapped around the smiling baby in her arms. He steps outside, entering the living room packed with his son's friends. Tagomi watches as Juliana and Noriyuki gush over their baby. Back to existing reality, Juliana meets George again. She finds out that, surprisingly, the man in the high castle has not been in contact. As they talk, George hurriedly shifts the topic, asking Juliana about her dinner in the Smith household. However, Juliana cannot give a proper answer. There is a part of her that sincerely likes the Smiths. George stands up and tells Juliana that she needs to get close to Helen Smith, as she is the head of the Nazi social scene. In the Smith household, Helen and Smith have difficulty managing their children's schedules. They argue about how they will get the kids to wrestling and ballet. Meanwhile, Thomas enters the scene and reveals that he has been selected as one of 10 members of the Hitler Youth to visit South America in hopes of educating the less fortunate. Fearing her son's illness may be exposed, Helen is stoked with fear, eventually deciding that Thomas isn't going. In Berlin, Joe wanders around his father's house. He is alone since his father has to go to the office early. As Joe looks around his father's room, he realizes that he has always been less involved in his father's life. Joe also learns that his father had another family, with a beautiful wife and 2 children, but they soon lost their life during a bombing raid. Meanwhile, Juliana arrives at Smith's house, looking for Helen to thank her for the dinner invitation. It turns out the visit is a convenient one, as Helen is currently hosting a bridge game. When Juliana expresses her interest in learning, Helen invites her to join the fun. It takes minutes for the conversation to descend to racial laws. During their chats, the women begin to detail the requirement of reporting genetic defects to keep the Aryan race strong. At the same time, Joe is again at the end of his metaphorical rope. He is sick and tired of people lying to him. Joe calls over Nicole, who he met at one of his father's parties, as he needs to talk to someone his age. Joe jumps into her car, desperate for an escape from everything around him. While Nicole and Joe walk through a park, Joe shares about his personal trouble. Since he learned about his birth, he has been holding much on his shoulders. When Joe finally reveals to Nicole that he's a Lebensborn, she leans and kisses him. It turns out Nicole is also a Lebensborn. This revelation only makes their chemistry grow stronger. In the following scene, Helen goes to her husband's office to talk to him about their son's condition. However, things are tense at the office, as the Pacific states have just located the most recent hideout of the man in the high castle. Helen confronts Smith about Thomas' trip to South America. She doesn't want him to go, yet Smith seems to be adamant. It turns out that Smith already has a plan in action. He has a group ransom to kidnap Thomas somewhere over the Andes Mountains. While the media will be all about how the son of a high profile was kidnapped by the resistance, in truth, Thomas will be safely living his remaining days, free from the death sentence he could have received due to his illness. Meanwhile, Juliana tries to live up to her new identity and blends in with the Nazis. She goes dress shopping with one of the ladies, Lucy Collins. While they talk, Lucy reveals she has been trying to get pregnant but has been unsuccessful for 3 years. She is confident the problem is with her so that she wouldn't take the test. She goes on to reveal that bearing children is of utmost importance to the Reich. After discovering a new side of the Reich, Juliana feels sorry for Mrs. Collins. In Berlin, Nicole brings Joe to a party, where he feels more at home. He finally has an opportunity to experience what Berlin is really like when one removes themselves from the political side of it all. Joe's drug-induced romantic foray with Nicole turns out to be an interesting contrast in his life. At the party, they all take hallucinogenic drugs, including Joe. Just then, Joe's visions start to show the partygoers as beasts, and himself leaving them behind. He also sees himself following Juliana to a quiet area and apologizing that the version of him in the film killed her. Juliana then kisses him, but when he pulls back, it's Nicole instead. Later, Nicole shows Joe a version of himself that is dead, saying they don't matter at all, dead or alive. Nicole then shifts back to Juliana, who reminds him that she saved his life. She reassures him that he must make that act matter. When Joe finally wakes up in the morning, He cannot figure out what is real and what isn't. Later, Juliana returns to see George. While sharing a beer, they talk about Juliana's childhood with Judy. Juliana can barely confine the emotions as she reflects on the fond memories. She tells George about how Trudy was convinced that she had found a way out, that she had stumbled upon the answer to everything. That night, Smith and his son talk about South America while they set the table for dinner. Helen enters the dining room and shares with Thomas the good news. As she barely holds back her brimming tears, she confides to him that he's going to South America. Finally, as the Ban the Bomb meeting watches the rousing speech addressed by John F. Kennedy's regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis and how the nation needs to move forward with careful action, the rest of the speech plays over the final action. Joe stands in front of a mirror, putting on the Nazi suit his father picked out for him. Reaching into the pocket, he pulls out a swastika armband and stares into it, only to be torn on what to do next. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and hit that like button to help our channel grow. Turn on the notifications so you won't miss any of our new videos. Thanks for watching.